All right. Welcome, everybody. I know some folks are still coming in, but we are very delighted to have you here on a fabulous Tuesday evening. Um, my name's Dana. I work here at Haymarket House. I help coordinate programming in this space. And I want to welcome you all to our event tonight, From the Ashes with Sarah Jaffe. Yeah. And our special guest, Danya Rajendra, who will be in conversation with Sarah. Um, just a heads up, I have heard there may be some tears flowing in this event. So if you need tissues, we will be passing them around. But we are very excited to be gathered in a space to talk freely about grief and loss and love and all the amazing things that make us a community of humans. And thank you, everyone, joining us on the live stream. So this event is being live streamed, as well as those of us here in person. How many folks here are familiar with Haymarket House? Yay! Okay, so welcome. Haymarket House is a community cultural event space. We do really cool things like book events, poetry readings, and lots of rabble-rousing and general political organizing. We get up to good trouble. If you are not already on our Chicago mailing list, we have a QR code out on the table in front, and we invite you to join our Chicago newsletter so you find out about all of our fabulous events. I also want to give a special shout out to the co-sponsors for this event in these times, yay, who are one of the many amazing institutions here in Chicago that we collaborate with at Haymarket House. And before we begin the program, I do want to acknowledge that Haymarket House events all take place on the occupied lands of the Council of the Three Fires tribes, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi, who are the indigenous keepers of this land, who were forcibly removed through acts of genocide, but still remain a strong, organized presence here in Chicago and in Illinois. I also want to acknowledge that for many of us, and we are very well aware of this in this room, settler colonialism is not a historical act, but it continues today, and we stand in solidarity with all of those in Gaza and the West Bank who are experiencing violence at the hands of our own government and the Israeli government during these dark times. And especially now, when there is so much to organize against, it is very important that we come together in community with one another, support one another, listen to amazing speakers like tonight, and we hope that you can continue to join us for more events like this. Without any more conversation from me, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who will get us started on the program.
So I'm already going to cry. You're just going to have to deal with me tonight. I'm so happy to be here at Haymarket House. I'm so grateful to the entire Haymarket team. I'm not even one of their authors, and they're spoiling me rotten. They're fantastic. You should buy all of their books. I am so grateful to be here with Danya, who got me through the grief that launched me on this book. We have taken grief road trips together and talked about everything that there is. And apparently she still learned something about me by reading this book, weirdly enough. And all of you, some of you I know and love, some of you I don't know, but I love you for being here. And because I did this at the Socialism Conference the other day, and I think it worked really well, I'm going to do it again, which is to ask everybody to just take a couple minutes at the start and talk to somebody near you, make a new friend if you're here alone. If you came with somebody, to make a new friend and talk to somebody you don't know, and just tell each other for a minute how grief has affected your life and maybe why that brought you here today. And we'll time you, don't worry. 2 minutes? Uh-huh. Good. Great. Perfect. Beautiful. Babies are unimpressed by me. There's a seat up front if you want. Exactly. We get everybody talking, and then we're like, I can't stop you talking. All right. Anyway, I'm going to throw this to Anya. Yeah, you're in charge.
All right. Hey. Hey. I'm going to invite you to take a deep breath. I always feel when I'm at the front of a room how exciting it is to get to be one of two people who looks out at what a beautiful crowd we are today. So look around. Take one more deep breath. And join me in celebrating the remarkable Sarah Jaffe and her beautiful, brave, and brilliant achievement that is From the Ashes. So, Sarah, as promised, I'm going to say a couple words about your book and then ask you a bunch of questions. And then hopefully you will have questions or statements, possibly or possibly not in the form of a question. I mean, we are lefties, right? So, this book is not a poem, but it is poetic. And originally I was going to pick out some of my favorite poetic lines to read to you, and I still may, but there were too many. So you'll have to buy the book and read it yourself. But before we dive in to the politics of grief and revolution in a world on fire, I wanted to talk about this book as the literary and artistic achievement that it is. So tell us about the choices you made around the craft. Why these theses? So much about you, not enough about you. So much about you. That's new for your readers.
Yeah.
It is an incredible thing to join Sarah, the author, the narrator, on this book of discovery. And so tell us, on your journey of discovery, you lived it and then you wrote it. Tell us about the choices you made around that.
Yeah, I'm a journalist, which means I'm not supposed to talk and write about myself, right? I'm supposed to be sort of objective. And for this book, that wasn't going to work, in part because I started writing it, or started thinking about writing it anyway after my father died, and it sort of turned my life upside down. And because of that, I was just seeing grief in everything that I wrote about, every story that I was covering. It seemed like I was talking about it all the time. And to write about it, more importantly, I think to report about it, I had to tell people why I was there, right? Why am I here asking you about your cousin who was killed by a police officer? Why am I here asking you about your father who died of COVID? Why am I here asking you about being in England while your family is in a refugee camp in Turkey? If I'm not willing to say, like, because I was undone by this experience. And so to do that, I was already throwing being an objective journalist out the window. Knowing anything about politics basically disqualifies you from being an objective journalist anyway. You know, I was having this conversation over dinner actually about, like, well, nobody hires me as a labor reporter because I know too much about labor. But thinking about how to tell my story in the midst of all of these stories, some of the ones I've just mentioned, which are experiences that I have never had, meant trying to figure out how I could tell my story without drawing equivalences that were completely inappropriate. And that ended up being sort of the bits about me are sort of separated. Like, you could read this book and just skip them if you wanted to. But they end up sort of appearing the way that grief kept appearing in my life, which is I would think it was over. And then it would come back for me and kick my ass in a whole new way. And yeah, so I thought about it in that way, sort of here's a thing I have to do to not be a monster, to not sort of be voyeuristic in telling these stories. I have to be willing to be vulnerable first, and I don't like it. And I'm terrified of it. And talking about this book has been harder than anything I've ever done before. But it felt necessary, and I hope that it adds something to the experience of reading it.
Thank you. Among the poetic elements is, as you can correctly judge from the cover, this book is fire. And part of what is so moving in the way that you talk about your own grief and you invite others to talk about their experience is how, like, insistently corporeal it is. Grief can mess with your mind, can mess with your heart, but it will also make you a real klutz. Like, you lose your keys. It's in your muscles, it's in your bone. And there's something about fire as a recurring motif through that helps make that so palpable. I would imagine, even for a reader who has not been marked by grief in the same way that many of us have been. Will you say a little bit about that as a motif in this book?
Yeah, I start the book with a police car on fire. So there's that. And I sort of, I thought about this, and I had conversations with people at one point who tried to get me to, like, ease into things a little bit more. And I was just kind of like, no, we're going straight in. That's just where we're going to be. And it kept turning up. Obviously, I'm talking about 20 uprising. A lot of things were on fire. Not enough of them police cars. But then I was thinking about all these other, right? So the book has 5 main chapters. And it is state violence, immigration, deindustrialization, COVID, and climate change. And I started to think about these as elements, right? That I was writing about water a lot when I was writing about migration. I was writing about boats. I was writing about floods. I was writing about the earth because I was writing about coal miners and deindustrialization. I was literally writing about going underground. COVID was obviously about breathing. It was about air, right? And then climate change is actually about all of them. So it's about hurricanes, like the one bearing down on the city that I'm supposed to be flying back to tomorrow. So wish New Orleans luck, y'all, please. We could use it. But also fires, but also, the earth shifting, the, sand erosion, and acidification of the soil, and all of these things. And the air being literally too hot and too polluted to breathe. So fire is obviously the one that makes the best cover. We went with From the Ashes after several different titles because, of course, it's a line from... We're all going to sing along with me at some point? No. Right? It's the famous labor song. And it... the world on fire thing, as a friend sort of correctly ribbed me about, like, is almost a cliche at this point for book titles. But it does seem to be the one that we sort of come back to over and over again and sort of say, like, everything's on fire, even when it's not actually on fire. Or as someone once said, like, too many things are on fire and too many of them are the wrong things. I think, again, when it comes to grief, when it comes to the physicality of it, again, I felt all of these things at different points, right? Interestingly, most often, I think I felt it as a gasping for air. I felt it as not being able to breathe. I still do sometimes. I don't know if that comes back around to what you wanted me to say, but yeah.
So you're a labor journalist, among other things.
Indeed.
You write about many things, but you perhaps are best known for writing about labor struggles and collective action. Yeah. And so it is arresting in a non-carceral way to come across the beginning of the book where you talk about why it does not work.
Yeah.
And then later in the book, you talk a lot about care workers and the expertise of all different kinds of experts necessary to see ourselves in and out of this difficult world. So can you talk a little bit about the balance of how much work there is in grieving and how it is not work?
Yeah, so some of you probably know I wrote a book called Work Won't Love You Back. And thank you. And it's actually really nice to be here in part because I didn't get to do this for that book because it came out in the winter of 2021. So, and in that book, I started out with like unpaid housework, right? So I'm really going in on like, here are things that are work, even though they are not paid like work. But it did, at the end of that book, get me to thinking about like, okay, then what am I going to say isn't work? Because there's a way, and there's sort of the like internet cliche of like, we've turned emotional labor into like, Venmo me for listening to you cry about your problems, which is not how we should understand emotional labor. But I had that further than just sort of making a joke about that and actually say like, okay, what isn't work? And when my father died, I sort of thought I could be good at grieving. I was like, okay, I'll go back to therapy and I will sit around and journal about my feelings. I'll take as much time as I can afford to take away from work, and I will get through this. And there will be a process that I can get through, and then I will be done with it, and I will get an A in grief the way I have gotten an A in everything my whole life. Yes, I'm an oldest daughter. And of course, that's just impossible, right? You can't get an A in grieving. You can't speed it up. You can't work at it. You can be harder on yourself during it and sort of make it worse. But there's not really a great way to make it better other than having time. And the time that we mostly need in a capitalist society needs to be time away from work. And so it was like, A, like the process of grieving literally is not work. B, like the only thing that really makes it better is not working. So in both directions, it struck me as sort of fundamentally anti-capitalist. And then I started thinking about how capitalism really doesn't care if we die. And, that was made very clear during COVID. But to a lot of the people I spoke to for this book, they were already well aware that capitalism didn't care if they died. There's one point where I was talking to, I went on a mine museum tour in Britain, in Yorkshire. And the guy who led the tour, they're all old miners. And they actually take you down an old mine, which is fascinating and terrifying. And at the end, they're sort of showing you like, this was what the mine face would have looked like. And he was like, so they would only allow 9 people into this little section of the mine face at once. And he's like, why do you think that was? And we were, guessing. And he goes, no, because if more than 10 people die at once, or if 10 or more people die at once, and it's a major incident, they have to shut the mine. And if fewer than 10 people die, they don't have to shut the mine for the day. And it was just like, yeah, imagine that being your experience going to work every day, right? So if this thing that we live under cannot sort of care about our lives and will not do anything other than gleefully feed us into the meat grinder over and over and over again, and grief is a thing that is not work, where does that leave us? And I think it leaves us with something that we don't pay enough attention to on the left and in the world at large.
There is this beautiful turn. Sort of
2/3 of the way through, maybe?
Yeah.
I'm looking at what chapter she's looking at. So
2:15.
Yeah.
Around that.
Yeah. 2/3, 3/4 of the way through.
Yeah, 2/3 of the way through. Where all these questions about time and the necessity of the ways in which grief is anathema to capitalism and we're just talking about kind of pivots towards walking. Because you narrate your own turn towards walking and about walking.
Yeah.
At the very beginning of the next chapter is the second line, and the idea of a public procession, which of course calls to mind all of the work of making struggle public. It made me think about the lesser known Jewish ritual at the end of Shiva, days after one's parents, one's siblings, and one loses a child. You sit for 7 days inside your home.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the 7 days, you go outside for the first time and you walk around the block with company. And that move from sitting to walking, there's a beautiful turn in the whole book.
Yeah.
To bring that kind of marching into it. And so, though grieving is not work,
Yeah.
though grieving can really only be made better, not better, will you talk about the importance of collectiveness?
Yeah, I think the other thing that made it easier to bear was Danya. It was other people who had been there. It was people who had experienced it. And it was actually, I was in Chicago sort of shortly after my father died. And it was in part because, I'll leave my ex-partner out of this, but I came to Labor Notes less than a week after my father died. I was supposed to come. The Labor Notes folks were lovely and said, we've got some room set aside. We'll give you a room so you can sort of retreat. And I got there, and one of the first places I went actually was to the Haymarket booth because I knew Rory's not here tonight, but I was like, Rory and John and Dana, there was like somebody will be there that can give me a hug. So it goes back that far. But yeah, I was there, and people that I didn't even know that well were sort of coming up to me and sort of joking like, welcome to the Dead Dads Club, but like with kindness and with care, that like the people who had been through it were the people who came and sat with me and walked with me and saw me, in a way that people who hadn't been through it sort of often spectacularly failed at knowing what to do or say. And it was true that sort of both like those intimate connections, the people who knew me well or not that well, but were sharing something incredibly intimate, and also being in space with people, that made me feel alive again, literally. A friend of mine said once about grieving that she was like, I'm still in the land of the dead. And it was being around people that made me feel like I was back in the land of the living. And then I'm working on this book, thinking about working on this book, and COVID hits, and we are all isolated immediately into little Margaret Thatcher units, right? It's individual men and women and families. And I didn't have a family at that point, so it was just me. And then the uprisings happen, right, in 2020, and suddenly we're all out in the streets. And it's this beautiful moment of rage and of grief, and also of collective care. And I just remember I was in Philadelphia, and there was this one person who had a little wagon, and they had made individual baggies with a mask, hand sanitizer, a bottle of water, and a granola bar in them. And we're just giving out as many of them as they could. And there were so many people doing things like that. And I was like, oh, this is what it would be like to actually sort of be held in grief collectively, right? That it would be political. And it would also be all of these acts of care. And yeah, I have been through several rounds of Black Lives Matter uprisings. I have been covering protests and social movements, labor movements for a long time. And there have been a lot of experiences of mutual aid that have been really important to me. After Hurricane Sandy, Occupy Sandy folks in New York, the UAW strike in 2019, I remember people like cooking for an open flame outside of one of the GM factories. And but that one it was so clear what was going on. We're grieving, and we're grieving not only George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, but also everybody who was sick and dying of COVID, that George Floyd's last words were the same thing that people were struggling with when they were struggling with the virus that disproportionately was killing Black and brown people, right? It was killing people who had to keep going to work. It was killing the essential workers. And for us to say okay, what does it look like to take care of each other? And the reason that they've pushed us back to normal so fast is because this, again, the capitalist system can't survive if we realize that it actually matters to us to take care of each other, and that it actually matters to us to grieve each other.
Among the riches in this book is an incredible stretchy back and forth between all kinds of histories, place histories, people's histories, lots of Uncle Frederick Engels,
Uncle
some
Freddie.
excellent poetic repetition of some Marx, Walter Benjamin, and
Gilmore.
Ruthie Gilmore, people in this room. And so here is an example on page 140. So I'm going to ask about history, and then I'm going to ask about the future, because so much about the thesis that grief is about the future, I think, might be counterintuitive. And so I want you to have all the space you can take up to talk about that. But before the future, the past. The strategy of organized abandonment that we now call neoliberalism was designed to splinter social solidarity, to crush not just labor unions and not just communism. I mean, that would be bad enough. But any sort of collective action, to break us up into little individual market actors who compete always with each other. Such competition does not exclusively or mostly break down along racial or gender lines, but it sure does make those lines brighter. Will you talk about the lines and crossing the lines and the lines of the past and the lines of the future?
Yeah, I'm not a historian. I'm not remotely trained in history. I did not take one single history class at the university level. But I'm always putting it in my books because, you know, as Daddy Carl and Uncle Freddie would remind us, right? It's always about historical materialism. It's always about how the past interacts with how conflicts in the past shape the present, right? And that the conflicts in the present will shape the future, and that the arguments we're having today will shape the arguments we're having tomorrow. And I'm not talking about the presidential debate, never mind. And so to think about, right, like what brought people to, I think that particular line is in the deindustrialization chapter, right? And so I'm talking about a historical process of deindustrialization that, you know, sort of started as soon as industrialization began, right? There was always a process of moving capital to places that it was most advantageous to take advantage of labor, often racialized and gendered labor, but also natural resources, to pollute someplace that hadn't been polluted yet, or just to move near water so you could move product faster. And that brought us to today, and those industrial also created climate catastrophe that we're facing. So to just sort of start a book that's talking about some of these processes and be like, well, right now everything's bad, without saying like, well, it's always been bad for a lot of people. And so, you know, some folks I know say, you know, capitalism everywhere is always fascism somewhere. And that's been true since the beginning of the thing. And to understand that like the misery of it will move, right? That right now we're seeing in real time on our phones what eliminationism looks like in Gaza, right? But it's also happening in other places, and it's also been happening historically in Palestine, in the South Sudan, in New Orleans, in Chicago, right? That it is happening all over the place. And that COVID sort of spread that around, made it more easy for a lot of us to see. But when I started thinking about grief, again, I had sort of imagined that I would just be very sad about the past, and I would sort of sit around with a lot of memories, and that would be how I felt. And Freud, who I argue with early on in the book, sort of describes mourning as a process of decaffecting from every memory of the loved object. And like, I just think he's so wrong. And it actually sounds more like a breakup than a whatever. And if you want to hear that disquisition, I was on Ordinary Unhappiness about it for a while, so we'll spare that one for now. But what I was not prepared for was how much it was about the future, that I was thinking about the things, the arguments I was not going to get to have with my father, the things that I would do with my life that he was not going to see. That was what was impossible, right? And that with that, it wiped out my sort of entire ability to see the future. I was just like in a fog, sort of one day at a time. Like, what do I have to do today? Okay, I got to write this article today because this editor asked me to do it and I still need to get paid. And again, throwing all those things together into the big, weird blender that is my brain, trying to come up with an idea of why it is a political question, right? That grief makes it hard for us to see the future. And we're sort of working backwards through my introduction. Because the first thing that I argue about grief in the introduction to this book is that grief is a rupture. And it is a rupture in the way that like Marx and Engels use that term in the Communist Manifesto, to say that this is something that is an absolute break with what has come before, and you will not sort of be able to see the other side of it from before, right? You can't imagine what it will be like. And that is on some level what all organizing is like, as well as you're sort of like, I can't see what this will do. I can't imagine what necessarily this is going to look like. To start a reading group that turns into a caucus that turns into taking over the Chicago Teachers Union. Sorry, Jesse. And then now the mayor of Chicago, right? Like these are things that you could not have imagined from that reading group, or maybe you did. I don't know. But now here it is. We're somewhere else. And we always have to be able to sort of throw ourselves into the thing, hoping we can imagine something that we want to see happening, but like not really being able to see it. And it helps to know about the past. It's really important to know about the past. But the things that failed in the past are not necessarily going to fail the same way in the future. And it's important in that way to sort of know both the past losses and also the past successes. To think about how things have changed during those processes to bring us to a point where, again, it feels like everything is breaking all the time right now. And again, I'm saying this going like, am I going to be able to get home tomorrow? Or am I stuck in Chicago for another week because New Orleans might be underwater this week? What can I imagine doing in that space that I couldn't imagine doing yesterday? And how is being in this space with all of you and having been in Chicago for the last week and a half made it possible for me to imagine things that I couldn't imagine last week?
Before we move on to the future, tell us about ghosts and being haunted. Bring both Stuart Hall and Mark Fisher.
I mean, and Walter Benjamin and Avery Gordon and so many people. Yeah, I'm an old goth and I love a cemetery. Dania and I went out to visit the Haymarket Monument and Emma Goldman and the rest of them yesterday. I love a cemetery. But in thinking about sort of being in the land of the dead and thinking about the things that I couldn't forget and the things that I couldn't see through, obviously it made me think of ghosts, and it made me think of, Walter Benjamin's line about even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he wins. What does that actually mean, right? It doesn't actually mean that he thinks that like the dead are going to rise and fight the revolution with us. It means that the dead are marshaled to justify awful things like what's happening in Gaza right now, right? The dead are being literally dug up in the path of the bulldozers digging the Dakota Access Pipeline. It means that, you can't go home to go to a funeral because you are on the wrong side of a border. And if you cross it again, you can't come back. To think about what it means to sort of be accountable to ghosts is to be accountable to the people who came before us, to that history, to the people that we've lost, which is why I get really, really mad as a Jewish person when they start talking about, well, Israel is doing what it's doing because something the Holocaust. And it's like, absolutely not. But what does it really look like? Because you also get this opposite argument, right? Where people will say like, oh, well, we can't get rid of student debt because it would be unfair to the people who've paid off their student debt, right? It would be unfair to the people who had it worse. Well, that's just an argument against like any progress or change ever, right? Like it's unfair for me to get a polio vaccination because people died of it and people are dying of it in Gaza right now, right? That's ridiculous. But what does it mean, really, to do justice to ghosts? What does it mean to do justice to my ghost? In my acknowledgments on this book, I say, my father would hate this book, but he's not here to stop me. And I had a dream about him last night that was a little on the nose. And yeah, so is he actually mad at me? I don't know. Do I believe in that? Probably not. But I don't know that I have easy answers on this. There are not any easy answers in this book. I'll spoil that for you right now. The thing that I am grappling with all the way through and come to at the end is like, what does it look like to care for the world, to care for each other, both personally, and I sort of write a lot about people who mean a lot to me individually and personally in this book, and also to care for everybody, even the people that I don't particularly like, to build a world where me or anybody else liking someone does not change their material circumstances in any way. I think thinking of that as a way of honoring our ghosts rather than somehow taking something away from them was important to me. Also, like Marx, I just love a spooky metaphor.
I mean,
you can get the really cool print that talks about capitalism being haunted over there by the door. The beautiful prints made by Nicole Manganelli of Radical Imprints. So there's a plug.
I could talk to you all night long.
And we have.
And we will again. And then someday when we are ghosts, hopefully, we'll just keep going. But I wondered if other folks have questions or comments
or thoughts.
Right. You don't even have to pretend they're questions. You can.
Hi. Sorry about my phone. You think about grief of like organizing as failing and failing and failing, maybe doing something that won't happen in your lifetime, but you're doing it anyway.
Yeah.
And getting back up. So is that sort of a thing? Not just people dying because it's, it seems impossible sometimes when you're trying to organize and like you can't see, like you talk about not being able to see the future.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of people who organize for stuff and they know, well, I'm not going to see it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, talk about being accountable to ghosts, being accountable sort of yourself as a ghost, right? Like, what is the world that I won't live to see? I am in my mid 40s. I probably will not live to see the end of capitalism, but maybe, it keeps trying to kill it. But yeah, I think there's something about that too, right? About envisioning yourself in that historical chain of people that, I claim as ancestors who were not related to me that we were visiting in the cemetery yesterday. And the people who will hopefully be here, not in some annoying long-termist digital people way, but in like a reality of like my niece will maybe have children and there will be people who are related to me, people who are not related to me who have babies. Sarah just left with her baby. But people that I love that are having babies that will be out there in a world that I want to be there for them. And it requires an ability to sort of let go of yourself. That's really, really, really hard in a world that just tells us that like our individual feelings are everything. Yeah. Yeah, we might make you guys.
Sure. I guess to that point, I mean, we live in a very atomized society, I guess, about the individual person's sort of self-expression or how they deal with their own issues. And I guess I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the relation between individual or personal expression of grief or how that is in the collective level.
Yeah, one of the many things that I sort of struggle with, right, is that you will sort of say that even if you're grieving the same person, no two people will experience it the same way, right? We will all feel it differently. We will all feel it at different times and different moments. And that's just like one of the really frustrating, confounding, and sad things about it. But also, again, right, Dania couldn't tell me what I was going to feel at any given time, but she could tell me if I was like, why can't I breathe? That she was like, oh yeah, I've been there. And that knowledge, even if we are not having it happen to us at the same time, felt really important. And then it became something to sort of pay forward, right? So like, rather than a reciprocal relationship, where, I mean, okay, you did lose another parent after, you know, we have, but also there were people who, you're out of parents. Tell Ajay to be careful. The friend who was here this weekend for Printers Row is somebody who I'd known for a while, whose father died several months after mine had, and I sort of immediately reached out to her. And it's something that you pay outward into the community. And I don't even think I wrote this into the book specifically. I've just been thinking about it in the last couple of weeks. Eva Kate, a philosopher who I actually quoted from her book called Love's Labor. So unsurprisingly, it was in Work Won't Love You Back. But she writes about this kind of nested caring obligations as something that build the community, and that you pay outward into the community, and the community, it's literally to each, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. And that grief is so much like that. And that if you can sort of let go of it needing to be commensurate or similar, those threads can actually help build a community in a way that, that is sort of counter to this feeling that we have to like hide it and put it away. And I still struggle with that myself all the time. The feeling that I should hide it, that it's too much. But actually that admitting to it has brought me closer to a lot of people and has helped build better communities, I think, in our lives. Did we have some other folks? Thanks. Back there.
Hey everyone, I'm Jesse. Sarah, thank you. I should say I lost my mom in the fall of 20 in the pandemic, and so I appreciate. I haven't read your book yet, but I appreciate the conversation and the thoughts, and look forward to reading it. I was hoping that I could get you just to hear your thoughts on what strikes me as being a contradiction on the left. In terms of the pandemic, which is that on the one hand, left-wing spaces rely on community solidarity. We make decisions together in groups. Our project is a collective one, and there's an important element us being together for that. And then on the other hand, precisely because we cared about each other, the left were the places where we were the most cautious about returning back into group spaces, where we were the most serious about social distancing, kept things remote, online, etc. And I just, in our work in the CTU, I really felt that contradiction, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts or insights about that.
Yeah, and not to like only focus on teachers, but like I did a lot of reporting for. Did Ari just go to? Oh, he's back there. So Ari was at Rethinking Schools at the time and commissioned a couple of big pieces for me on sort of teachers specifically. And I think one of the challenges, right, was like the kind of organizing that good teachers unions were doing was with the parents and with the students. And then suddenly everybody was isolated, and a lot of the pitting of the parents against the teachers that had been on the wane sort of seemed to come roaring back. Because nobody was in the same space together anymore. And that was really, really hard. And one of the things that we were talking about this over dinner again, actually, one of the things that I've been thinking about with this book is like the need for spaces that are part of the movement, but that are not the organizing space specifically, so that we can sort of have, and we can have the processing, and we can have the, being triggered and being grieving and all of those things. And also just so that we can remember that we're like people and we're not sort of Twitter accounts to be mad at. That really, like, I think that there was something, I spent a lot of time in England, and like the pandemic was, if anything, sort of more horribly timed for the British left than over here, because they had just had the election, gotten their asses kicked in 2019. Jeremy Corbyn has stepped down as the leader of the Labour Party, and everybody's just fighting on Twitter because they're in lockdown for months. And so I've just been pushing everybody. It's like, we need more spaces where people can just remember that, like, that dude you've been yelling at on Twitter for, 3 years, you actually like him. You're actually cool, and what that looks like. I mean, we're sitting in this beautiful house with this beautiful space. And I'm so happy that this place exists, and we need like 1 million more of them, at least one in every city. That is the space for like the Italians have social centers, right? The one place that I got to go on tour for Work Won't Love You Back, that was like once things had lifted enough, the Italian translation came out. And so I was doing these talks at these social centers, which were organizing spaces, but they were also, there's a cafe and there's an art space and there's a this and there's a that. And some of them had been squats and some of them were not, but like they were a place where you could come together with people who were like-minded, not necessarily to have to like work to organize, but to just hang out. And like, yeah, and that was so hard, again, with the pandemic and with spaces. And I, you know, whenever you have a mask on and you're like, smile, and you're like, I'm trying to smile really hard with my eyes. I think of that bit on Drag Race where somebody did Tyra Banks for the thing, and she actually put like red makeup so he looked like her eyes were bleeding from eye smiling too hard. I think about that more often than I should. But like, yeah, the space is where we can remember that we're people with like messy human needs, in addition to the spaces where we really have to sit down and talk about strategy because like, oh my God, there's a genocide going on and the world is on fire in a million different ways. And like, I think that actually we need that space in order to do the strategic work better, if that makes sense. I don't know if that's actually answering your question at all. Oh, I see Miriam back there, so we know we got Pell and her.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for this book. It's beautiful. And I know it took a lot out of you to write it. So I have two questions. The first one is, how are you different now for having written the book? What's different about Sarah? And then the second question is kind of like a provocation as I was reading the book to say that we don't actually have a common grammar for grief.
Yeah.
I mean, not even in, like, if we just took the US,
yeah,
or if we just took Chicago,
yeah,
or if we just took Rogers Park,
yeah,
let alone the transnational lack of translation about what grief means and looks like. It's a very culturally specific thing. We talked about that briefly, but I think because of that, it leads to the possibility of people weaponizing grief much easier. And so therefore is part of the problem of the conflicts in our movement.
Yeah.
There's we're not speaking the same language.
Yeah.
And we're not doing that in general, but we're also definitely not doing that when it relates to grief. So I'm wondering what you learned through the process of like really going in depth in this.
Yeah.
That would teach us potentially how to create spaces for common language.
Yeah.
Even if it's not common feeling.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's the challenge, right? Is like, I mean, whether it's like we literally come from different traditions where like in Jewish tradition, you're supposed to bury the dead very quickly and you sit Shiva for 7 days. And then there are all sorts of different histories. There are different histories that were sort of stomped out by colonialism. And then there's the sort of post-Protestant, like whatever that we're supposed to do right now, where basically maybe you get a day off from work if there's a funeral and you probably don't. And so, you know, at best we have different traditions. At worst, we have sort of no traditions. And I write about in the book the way like my family sort of did nothing. We didn't even have a funeral for my father. It was, you know, I was the least capable of doing it at that time and also the only one in my family who would have been capable of doing it. And yeah, and I think these are precisely the sort of challenges, right? Because like, yeah, I again, when you say weaponized grief, I think of Israel for unsurprising reasons. And, you know, this has been a huge tension this last year, right? Where there are these arguments about like, do we grieve for people equally? The answer is very obviously no as a society, right? But then people are, you know, do we grieve for the Israeli hostages? Do we grieve for, you know, like what is that? What does that look like? Is it grief even, right? Or are we sort of attaching ourselves to things that we're not really grieving? And yeah, and like I wish I had like a great answer for how to like cross all these bridges perfectly, but then I would be a better organizer than you, and that's definitely not true. So, but again, I feel like the first thing we have to do is like build the spaces where we can even just talk about it. And that space has to be like, no, this is what I'm experiencing first before it's like, and this is what the rules are, and this is how you have to treat me, and this is whatever. It just be like, my heart feels like it's about to explode right now. And I haven't slept in a week, or whatever that is. That we have to have spaces where we can bring that in order to get to the next step. And I think because Miriam, I obviously interviewed Miriam for the book, and the thing that you said about, we were talking about working with the survivors of police torture in Chicago, and as an abolitionist, not being able to get on board with their demands for retribution in a certain way, but saying like, I can accompany you through your grief. And yeah, we have to sort of get better at accompanying people in the feeling without necessarily saying that makes everything correct. And so basically I'm just quoting you back at yourself to answer your question. And how am I different is like 1,000 ways. I'm better at apologizing to people. I really realized that again this summer. I am more patient, which is shocking to people who know me, because I'm really still not a terribly patient person, but I'm more than I used to be. I'm still terrified of talking about myself in public. If you notice me not making eye contact with the audience very often. But I think I'm more aware that I can do hard things. And I am, it hasn't changed my political orientation to the world and the things that I care most about, but it has changed how I feel about sort of showing up to those things. And as I was saying, it's made me more and more and more insistent on both, like, we need to buckle down strategically and have a freaking plan for how we stick, whatever in the gears of the machine and it stop. And also that, like, oh my God, we need spaces where we can smile and laugh and actually remember that we are doing this in part because we care about other people. So yeah.
Okay, so you've touched a few times now on that weaponization of Jewish grief in this genocide we're all watching in Palestine. And as someone who is Jewish and has been trying to organize for an end to this genocide, for Free Palestine, all of that, there is so much grief. Yeah. But I do feel like it often gets a little bit lost in all the logistics of organizing events and actions and all of that. So I was wondering if you have any words on bridging that gap between the emotions and the work itself in a way that holds meaning and power and any of that.
Yeah, I got sort of more aggressively Jewish this year than I've ever been. I was Dan sent me a recipe for challah, so I taught myself to bake challah. We did, Shabbat candles together over Zoom a few times. It was just I really needed to not let the worst people in the world have this thing. And it was my father's side of the family who were Jewish. So, which by the way means that Israel probably wouldn't even let me in because I'm not Jewish enough for them. I'm also not Jewish enough for them because I think that Palestinians are people who have rights and should get their land back. But, the sort of weird birthrightness of it all is, problematic in so many ways. And yet I was raised with this set of beliefs. I was raised with these set of practices, and they mean something to me. Sort of precisely when somebody's coming for them, which sometimes means Nazis marching in Charlottesville chanting "Jew will not replace us," and sometimes it means Benjamin Netanyahu saying he speaks for me. In both of those cases, I am this is important to me. And there's a line in the book somewhere where I'm writing about Palestine, and I finished this book, the first draft of it, September 15th of 2023. And so by the time I got my edits back, I had to tear a big chunk out of the first chapter and write a lot more about, Palestine. I had some in there before, but it got bigger. And at one point, I'm like, it's not even Jewish grief that matters to the state of Israel. It is the usefulness of certain dead Jews. And I found that like such a horrific realization that like only just sort of came out of me as I was rage typing into my laptop. Because if we are grieving for Palestinian people as well as Jewish people, then we are grieving wrong. And if, they have made very, very clear that they give not a shit about, any of the lives of the hostages, and they're very happy for them all to die if that's useful. That's just perfectly fine. And so, and it's felt like an awful catch-22. Ari and I were having this conversation the other day, actually, about the ways in which it's felt like an awful catch-22 to just be like, how do I say anything? In the first few weeks, I remember saying a lot. I was like, I would like the Goyim to shut up. I would like most of the Jews to shut up. Would like it to stop. But that didn't help at all. And again, I think what has helped me has been getting involved in and also just connecting with my friends and my sort of chosen family, and lighting Hanukkah candles in my dad's menorah and saying like, you can't have this. You don't speak for it. The tradition of anti-fascism in the Jewish community is at least as old as Zionism, and it's way cooler. Way cooler. So I know we have one Beth is in the back here who's also in the book. And so I wanted to make sure we give her a chance to speak.
Thank you, Sarah. So I saw you at Socialism, and I wanted to let everybody else have a chance to speak, because I feel like I'm a nurse, so I went through COVID, and Sarah interviewed me a couple of times, but the last part was really about 2 years in 2022, like where are we at? So I worked a COVID unit 3 times at the public hospital here in the city. So I just, first of all, want to say thank you publicly for doing this, because I've got like a knot in my stomach, because it's been so hard, even though COVID's over, to really that's not the case, as we all know. But it's been very challenging, and just to be able to say that grief, and putting in your book, and I want to share it with my coworkers, that what we're still going through it, not just because of COVID, but because of everything that neoliberalism has done to the healthcare system, and it's not in a good place. So it helps us to actually know that grief is okay. And we grieve by both being really emotional, and we protected each other, but then we would get really angry, right? And then we did strike. I mean, I talked to Sarah about that in other interviews, but I just feel like the challenge is really about how to keep, and there's so many defeats, so it's like it piles on top of each other. Losing legal right to abortion and what it's done to reproductive rights, Palestine, and, I get really emotional around the healthcare workers it ties in everybody, not everybody that I work with sees that, but a lot of them do. So I thank you for legitimizing that it's okay, because we're mainly women too. So, of course we're just emotional, but it was really hard to hold all that and hold everybody. We were the people that COVID patients were seeing in many instances last. And so we carried a lot of that. But the struggle that we still have is like how we're still grieving. So fighting and really taking on capitalism is a challenge, because it's been both, difficult because they've taken advantage of it, our bosses, but also just how to keep going. And so I just feel like, I'm sure everyone in that place too. It's very, very hard. So best thing about it, though, it's really exposed how bad the system is to a whole bunch of people. But the reorganizing or keeping on organizing is challenging. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or anything. Sorry.
Don't apologize. Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for wonderful conversation sort of at the beginning of when I started working on this project, and then like further along, and helping me think through things. And like, again, turn this back on you and be like, it was one of the things that you said to me was like, we are the people that like, we see people last. We were there with people when their family wasn't allowed to come into the hospital, and we are carrying that. And it just made me think that, like, right, the rest of us were sort of locked away from it. And we were ambiently aware it was happening. And sometimes, like you were taking care of somebody who was really sick in your home. But most of the time, like, there was a distance from how many people were sick and how many people were dying and how bad it actually was. And that experience got sort of, outsourced onto the healthcare workers who were doing that work and experiencing that regularly. And like some of the other essential workers, but like you were the ones who were with people when they died. And that is just an amount of grief that, like, yeah, it has not been acknowledged that, like, in addition to all of the thank you essential workers and whatever science, that it's like, you grieved for us too. And that was something that the rest of the country was able to be like, oh, back to normal. And it's like, no, we're having another spike, and we're seeing, patients come up and like, the world has literally moved on to trying to ban masks. And meanwhile, it's still all falling on healthcare workers who are mostly women. And, I think, again, it was you who was telling me about how many people were quitting and how many people were just leaving the profession or going to become traveling nurses so they could control their schedules more. Yeah, because you just can't keep holding that for everyone out. And like, yeah, and I sort of wonder, actually, sorry to keep doing, I want to ask you more questions, but like, talked a little bit about like the union had like structures for talking about things, but like, I wonder if you feel like that's been enough, or if there are ways that we could do, we as a broader movement could help support the union in doing that stuff.
I mean, they provided, they were aware of what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
So they provided therapy for us, but that hasn't continued.
Yeah.
And when I say the system is really just, it's a disaster, right? And not to scare people, but it's not as many parts of the economy and industries. People are short, so it's not continuing. So we need more of those spaces, but I think it's on every level, right?
Yeah.
Palestine, I can't even, like, I did some speak out, like with coworkers, and I work with a lot of a good portion of Palestinian doctors.
Yeah.
And it was just gut wrenching. So there's not space for that, but no, there needs to be more of it.
Yeah.
Obviously. So.
Yeah, it just feels like maybe a way that like the rest of the movement can find ways to be more supportive of the healthcare workers and think about like, how are we caring for the carers, not to be like kind of cliche about it, but there were a lot of signs and a lot of clapping, but also a lot of people tried to do like materially supportive things early on. And is there a way we can harness some of that again and say like, look, people are still suffering?
I'm going to invite us to take another deep breath. I'm going to ask one more question.
Okay.
And then I think, unless you want to keep talking, it's your night.
John, do we have any questions from the internet or no? Okay.
The internet has no questions.
That's okay. Well, I mean, ask one more and then.
Yeah. So you're a journalist still, and
haven't quit.
One of the beautiful things about being a journalist is getting to write the first draft of history. And in this book, you write a first draft of history and a first, or maybe first and a half. Miriam's question pressed this a bit, like a first draft of your next self, of the self you are and are becoming in a world without your dad. Yeah. And a beautiful tension and conflict throughout this book is the way in which this moment, this like world historical moment that we continue to live through, is both intensely scary and inspiring us to be more fearless in our clarity and in our calls for change and in the ways in which we might connect with one another. And When Miriam asked her question, the second question about the vocabulary of grief, it occurred to me that part of what's so beautiful in this book is the way in which we first have to discover a vocabulary of grief inside ourselves to make some sense, both inside and outside of ourselves, about what this is. That at least my own experience of losing a parent is that it's so strange. The world is strange. Your own self is strange. And that you both need other people to say, yes, it is normal that you can never find your keys. That's very normal.
Mm-hmm.
But also, like, I don't know how it will get better for you, but it will likely get better. I don't know how it will get better for us, but we are working together to make this incredibly difficult time better for us now and for those who come next. And so I wonder, in the spirit of grief is about the future, if you would reflect a bit on that.
So this summer, I was like, I'm going to have a good summer. Famous last words. And one of the things that I did this summer, which ended up being sort of the defining thing that I did this summer, was I recorded the audiobook of this book. And I thought about this because I was like, I know that's going to be rough. I know it's going to be rough because writing it was really rough. Reading it over, doing edits was rough. But like sitting in a booth for days on end, reading it out loud into a microphone, be really rough. And it was. And I have this terrible habit of like, keep going. I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm off a cliff. I don't slowly, gradually like slide into I'm not doing well. It's just like, I'm great. I'm terrible. So I was fine for the first couple of days. And then I started to be like, oh, I'm starting to feel like a little something, something. And then it was election week in England, which was terrible. I was in London. And the gentleman who directed the audiobook, his name is Perrin Sledge, who is just a lovely human that I had not met beforehand, but they hired him. And it like, if he had not been a lovely human, I would have just like had a breakdown in that booth. Instead, I just had one when I went home. And it really did sort of send me back into like 2018. My father died in April of 2018. Sent me back into like that first year level of grief of like anxiety, hair trigger, not sleeping, super overreacting to absolutely everything in my life, terrible sort of rejection sensitivity and fear of abandonment, like all of these things. My therapist is concerned. It really sort of sent me back there. And I spent like a month and a half in sort of that place. I gave up caffeine entirely because my heart felt like it was going to explode again. And the thing about it was like, I knew better how to deal with it, even though it was terrifying, even though it was awful, even though I was biting the heads off people who were trying to care for me. I also knew who to call. I apologized to people that I yelled at. One person in particular, he knows who he is. And I asked for what I needed, which is terrifying for me. I am not very good at that. I'm very good at forcing myself to keep going. And so it was like, even when I felt like I was back in the thing, in the hole of it, right? In the pit, in the fog, in the whatever metaphor you want, I knew what was happening because I was like, oh, this is where I am. This is what's these, I remember these feelings. Okay. Then, okay, what do I need to do? What do I need? I need to breathe, to stretch. I need to go for a walk. I need to not drink caffeine. I need to not have an alcoholic beverage. I need to call Dania. I need to call Brett. I need to call Craig. I need to let the people who don't know me that well but are trying to like show up for me even when they say the wrong thing. And I need to sort of put myself back into a crowd. I need to go to a march. I need to go to a protest. I need to go be around other people who are feeling things, even if what they're feeling is not exactly what I'm feeling. And I want to say, like, I got better, like the Monty Python when he's like, she turned me into a newt. Sorry guys, my references are old. I'm old. But you know, it turned me into a newt and I got better. It will happen again. You know, I've still got one parent left. but also like this particular grief will come for me again. Hopefully not this bad again, but it might. And I think knowing how to face that, knowing how to imagine that like I will get through it because I have gotten through it, even if, oh my God, when you're in it, it feels like it will never end. That, you know, it is preparation for all of the awful things. It's preparation for the political moments that feel like the world is ending. Because I think the thing that I have learned from another friend who is not here tonight, who is Danya's partner, Ajay, is right. The world is not ending. Humans may be ending. We may be running ourselves out of things. Capitalism might kill itself and kill all of us with it, but it is not doing it evenly. It's not doing it all at once. We are not all in this. There are often people who are way worse off than I am. And how do I step back up, take care of myself so that I can step back up, but, you know, get back into the struggle for the people that are not here yet, but that will maybe get to see the better world that we're all bashing our heads against the wall to create. So,
ladies and gentlemen, children of all ages, Sarah Jaffe.
So before we're done, Danya promised to read a poem for us.
I'm going to do, it's been 2.5 years since my mom died, and I'm still really forgetful, and I'm wondering when I can stop using my dead parents as an excuse, but today is not that day. So I'm going to borrow your phone to read my poem. John, would you be so kind as to help a forgetful sister out?
There you are.
Thank you. Also, Jordan, thank you very much for moving the microphone. The name of this poem is Trash Fire. My father died, my mother downsized. She handed over long-held stuff she couldn't see with strangers. Things she couldn't trash, couldn't keep. One box held her braid cut off in her teens. Now she is failing. Cancer. I visited. It went badly, as ever. I escaped upstate, bought 2 pair of pruning shears, snapped every dead stick in sight, the clippers extending my reach and grasp, drawing plant parts toward me, a snip, a pile. Winter, too long a way off to wait, so into the pit. It's May, too warm for a fire. Too bad. I twist sections of the Times, nurse the blaze with paper, sip bourbon, spear marshmallows. The sugar glows white, kisses the heat, flames blue, abates.
Thank you, Danya.
Thank you, Sarah.
Everybody. Yeah, thank you everyone for being here, for indulging us in all our feelings and your own feelings. I'm happy to sign some books if you guys want us to sign some books, hang out and chat, and then we can go to, what's the pub that we're supposed to go to afterwards? Bar on Buena for post whatever beverage for anybody who wants to join us. But we'll be here for a little bit. Thank you.